On the morning of October 14, 1913, miners at the Universal Colliery in Senghenydd, South Wales, were working 2,000 feet below ground when a massive explosion occurred at 8:10 a.m. The blast claimed the lives of 439 men and boys, with another victim dying during the rescue efforts. This tragedy stands as the deadliest coal mining disaster in British history and the sixth worst worldwide. In the early 20th century, coal mining was a major industrial activity in Wales, playing a crucial role in powering factories, steamships, trains, steel production, manufacturing, shipbuilding, as well as meeting the military needs of the Royal Navy and the British Army, particularly at the beginning of World War I. The population of the South Wales Coalfield increased by 320,000 people from 1851 to 1911. By 1913, the industry employed 250,000 workers, producing 56.8 million tons of coal annually. At that time, Britain supplied 25% of the world's coal, with over half being exported. Despite its economic significance, mining was perilous, with miners working long hours in poorly ventilated tunnels, facing dangers such as methane and coal dust explosions, roof collapses, and flooding that posed a threat of drowning and cutting off escape routes. Today's story explores Britain's most tragic mining disaster, which occurred at the Universal Colliery in Senghenydd. By the early 20th century, this colliery had become one of the largest and most productive in the South Wales Coalfield. Established in 1891, it played a crucial role in meeting the immense coal demand of that era. To understand the gravity of this event, we first need to explore the layout of the colliery. The Universal Colliery worked 3 seams, 4 feet, universal, and 9 feet, divided into the west and east sides. The west side mined the 4 feet seam, while the east side managed all 3 seams, interconnected by drifts. The colliery featured 2 main shafts, Lancaster downcast and York upcast, each 18 feet 6 inches in diameter. These shafts reached a depth of 650 yards, with the coal primarily extracted from the Lancaster shaft. By 1913, the colliery was producing about 1,800 tons of coal daily. This coal was loaded into common Welsh wagons, designed to hold extra coal above their tops. Haulage primarily took place in return airways, except for the Kimberley and Ladysmith districts, where it was conducted in the intake. Worth mentioning that no explosives were used for extraction. The day of October 14, 1913 began with a mandatory fire inspection at 3 a.m., where firemen descended the pit to check for gas, using naked flames to detect dangerous levels. They had 3 hours to complete their checks before the miners started their shifts. By 6 a.m., 950 men had descended for their shift, which was set to last until 2 p.m. However, at 8:10 a.m., an explosion rocked the west side of the underground workings. Edward Shaw, the colliery manager, took action. Along with overman D.R. Thomas, Shaw descended the York shaft and discovered that workers on the east side were unharmed, ordering their evacuation. They then moved to the west side, finding injured men and organizing their rescue. The scene was described as exactly like looking into a furnace. With water pipes fractured, Shaw and the survivors used hand extinguishers to tackle the fire. Shaw then coordinated rescue and firefighting efforts from neighboring collieries with specialist mines rescue teams, Red Cross workers, and local ambulance services arriving by 11 a.m. Desperate rescue parties risked their lives, with many suffering injuries from roof collapses and carbon monoxide poisoning. Despite these dangers, they saved numerous lives throughout the day and night, finding the last group of 18 survivors around 1 a.m. These were the last survivors to be found. A journalist from the Times poignantly wrote, "The numbers are truly awful. We talk in odd terms of the decimation of a regiment in a bloody battle. But here a great community engaged in the pursuit of a peaceful vocation is threatened with the loss of at least a quarter of its able-bodied manhood." The atmosphere in Senghenydd was somber, with streets filled with silent, aimless crowds. Rescue operations continued through the night and into the next day, focusing on finding survivors and combating the fire that hindered access to some western workings. Roof collapses and methane outbursts posed significant challenges, injuring several rescuers, one fatally. Firefighters built walls of sandbags, turf, and sand to contain the smoke, working in 20-minute shifts due to the intense heat and toxic gases. Despite wearing respirators, several rescuers were overcome by the effects of firedamp. Within 2 days, temperatures dropped and the volume of smoke was reduced, but miners still faced numerous obstacles, including roof collapses and large pockets of trapped firedamp. Clearing these falls and finding bodies was slow and arduous, taking until November 8th for the first of the 4 working districts to be explored and cleared of bodies. The explosion, fire, and subsequent decomposition made it difficult to identify many victims. Some had to be identified by their personal effects, and some bodies remained unidentified. By November 17, the Mafeking and Pretoria districts had been fully explored, with more than 200 bodies recovered in the preceding 2 days. On November 20th, an official announcement reported that 439 miners had died, with 33 still unaccounted for. Toward the end of the month, the men voted to return to work, even though the western workings were still out of action and 11 bodies were still missing. It is crucial to understand that this was not the first disaster at the Universal Colliery. Industrial historians Helen and Baron Duckham described it as an unlucky mine. On May 24, 1901, around 5 a.m., 3 underground explosions occurred as the night shift was leaving the pit. The blasts damaged the winding gear, delaying debris clearing and rescue operations. Tragically, 81 men perished. An inquiry revealed high levels of coal dust in the mine. The method of loading coal onto trucks generated dust, fueling a chain reaction of explosions. By October, an inquest concluded that safety precautions had not been followed, and better watering could have reduced the airborne coal dust. Additional issues arose in October 1910 when a heavy roof fall released trapped firedamp, leading to a temporary evacuation. In 1906, a major explosion at a colliery in Courrières, northern France, claimed over 1,000 lives. The report attributed this disaster to the accidental ignition of firedamp, worsened by coal dust. To prevent similar catastrophes in British mines, the Royal Commission was formed, reporting back in 1907, 1909, and 1911. These reports culminated in the Coal Mines Act of 1911, which took effect in December of that year. Among various safety measures, the Act mandated that ventilation fans in all collieries be capable of reversing the air current underground, with implementation required by January 1, 1913. However, Senghenydd failed to meet this requirement. The Mines Inspectorate granted an extended deadline of September 1913, which was also missed. Despite the new regulations, our mine continued to operate in violation of the Act. The open-ended trams used on our site, piled high with coal, allowed dust to rise, and tubs from certain districts were hauled against the air current, blowing dust into the workings. Only one wet stretch existed on the haulage road, with generally dry and dusty conditions elsewhere. To manage the dust, 8 men were engaged daily in shoveling dust from the floor, though efforts to clean the roof and sides were impractical, leading to another breach of the Act. Watering arrangements included pipes down each shaft, connected to hoses along the haulage roads, with floors watered nightly. The roof and sides were not watered, and beyond the pipe ends, water carts were used. Tubs were also sprinkled with water at specific points, but this was insufficient to suppress dust effectively. The water supply, drawn from various sources, included 60 gallons per hour from the Lancaster pit, 80 gallons per hour from the York pit, and 558 gallons per hour from the sump, with an additional 1,000 gallons per hour from the Sermoil reservoir. Ventilation was another issue. A Walker indestructible fan placed at the surface and driven by a steam engine provided ventilation. The fan, 24 feet in diameter, operated at 47 RPM, exhausting 200,000 cubic feet per minute at a water gauge of 2.3 inches, with 152,000 cubic feet entering the west side. Although capable of producing more air, 400,000 cubic feet at a water gauge of 4 inches, the fan's current reversal arrangement was incomplete, a requirement that should have been operative by January 1, 1913. Extensions were granted until September 30th, but the work remained unfinished. At the inquiry, the owners and manager admitted to violating Section 31(3) of the Coal Mines Act, 1911. Records of air measurements were not maintained as prescribed, lacking proper signatures. The mine generated large volumes of inflammable gas, with post-explosion measurements indicating about 1,200 cubic feet per minute. Sudden gas outbursts had previously forced worker withdrawals. Cambrian safety lamps with lead rivet locks were used, but fitted with unapproved glass. These lamps were lit, locked, and issued at the surface and examined at locking stations underground. There was no written authority from the management for this work, as required by the Act. The hazardous mix of dust and poor ventilation only needed a spark to ignite a disaster. An electrical system was used to send signals throughout the colliery. There were over a dozen sets of equipment in total, each consisting of a trembler bell, 6 to 9 dry cells, and 2 bare wires supported on insulators. The bell would ring sharply when the wires were separated after being brought together, creating a short circuit. The explosion was likely triggered by an electrical spark from the signaling gear, igniting methane gas, firedamp. This initial explosion caused coal dust to rise, igniting and resulting in a series of devastating, self-fueling explosions. The Senghenydd explosion is considered the worst mining disaster in British history. It resulted in the tragic loss of 440 men from a small community, with 60 of the victims being under 20 years old, including 8 who were just 14. This devastating event left 542 children fatherless and 205 women as widows. The emergency procedures were heavily criticized. The absence of respirators at the mine was believed to have cost lives, and the lack of an adequate water supply for firefighting was also condemned. Additionally, there was criticism of the mine manager, Shaw, for failing to fix the ventilation fan before the explosion, and for delaying seeking assistance from rescue teams until an hour and a half after the explosion. Shaw was fined £24 for 17 breaches of the Mines Act 1911, and the company was fined £10, with an additional £5 and 5 shillings in costs. The Merthyr Pioneer newspaper calculated miners' lives at 11 plus 1/4 D each, or around £16 in 2024 money. After reopening, the colliery never reached the same levels of employment as before the explosion. Shaw continued as the mine's manager until its closure in November 1928. In 1981, a memorial to those lost in the disaster was unveiled by the National Coal Board outside Nanty Park Primary School, which now stands on the former colliery site. The monument is a 20-foot-high replica of the colliery's winding gear. A second monument, dedicated to the victims of both the 1901 and 1913 explosions, was unveiled in 2006. On the 14th of October 2013, the centenary of the disaster, a Welsh national memorial to all mining disasters was unveiled at the former Pithad.